The dust of Italy still carried the scent of fear. Years had passed since the massacre at Cannae, yet in every Roman tavern, in every senator's whispered conversation, one name still lingered like a curse: Hannibal Barca. The fields that once drank Roman blood had long turned green again, but the memories had not. To the Roman mind, Cannae was not just a defeat, it was humiliation made immortal. 70,000 soldiers dead, entire legions swallowed by a man who had crossed the Alps with elephants and madness in his eyes. The Roman Republic had survived, yes, but its spirit had cracked. Even their gods, it seemed, had turned their faces away that day. Rome after Cannae was a city trembling between vengeance and fear. The Senate, once proud and bold, now debated in shadows. The people spoke of Hannibal as though he were a phantom capable of appearing anywhere, a monster who could cross mountains, command storms, and outthink entire armies. In truth, Hannibal had done something far greater than any sword could. He had entered the Roman imagination. And once inside, he never left. The sound of hoofbeats in the night could send panic through villages hundreds of miles from the front. Every rumor of movement in the south made consuls tighten their fists and generals second-guess their own plans. The Roman military, for all its might, had never faced a mind like Hannibal's. His strategies were not built on brute strength but on rhythm, deception, and emotion. He didn't just fight armies, he fought the confidence of those who commanded them. Even as he retreated deeper into Italy, avoiding direct sieges of Rome itself, his presence was a constant siege upon the Roman soul. His army, made up of Africans, Spaniards, and Gauls, was more like a living embodiment of chaos than a disciplined force, yet under his hand, it moved with purpose and precision. To Roman generals bound by tradition and hierarchy, Hannibal's methods were witchcraft. In response to this terror, Rome was forced to transform. Out of desperation came discipline. The Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus, later known as Cunctator, the delay. His approach was the opposite of every Roman instinct. No glorious charges, no direct confrontation. Instead, patience. Attrition. Exhaustion. The Fabian strategy, as it came to be known, was not born of courage but necessity, a strategy designed to survive Hannibal rather than defeat him. Rome would no longer fight his war, it would starve him of opportunity. Fabius's soldiers burned their own crops, denied Hannibal supplies, and watched him from the hills like wolves too cautious to bite. For the first time, Rome was learning that pride could kill nations faster than swords. And yet, even as Rome adapted, the fear persisted. Children grew up hearing tales of the man who had outwitted their fathers. Songs of victory over minor enemies rang hollow when Hannibal's name still hung in the air like smoke. The great city was wounded not by a weapon but by memory itself. Generals who once boasted of destiny now spoke in wary tones about chance and fate. In the Senate, there were whispers that perhaps Rome had finally met its equal, that even Jupiter might admire the audacity of a man from Carthage. But the Romans were nothing if not relentless. They rebuilt, reorganized, and reimagined themselves. Legions were raised again and again, each one sent out with the same grim oath, to destroy the shadow of Hannibal. Behind every new general was the ghost of the one who had failed. Behind every victory was the fear of another Cannae. Rome's resilience became legendary, but that resilience was born out of trauma, not triumph. And in that paradox, that Rome became mighty precisely because one man broke its spirit, lies the heart of the story to come. For even after Hannibal's defeat, long after his army had faded into history, Rome could not forget him. The name Barca had become a symbol of the impossible. He was not merely a general, he was a myth, and myths have a way of outliving empires. In every triumphal march, in every new war, the Senate still felt the ghost of that one Carthaginian mind that had once brought Rome to its knees. What Rome did not yet know was that Hannibal's greatest victory was not on the battlefield of Cannae, but in the invisible war that would follow, the war for Rome's confidence, its memory, and its very sense of invincibility. That is where our story begins, not with the clang of swords, but with silence, the uneasy calm of a civilization that has survived the unthinkable but can no longer feel unbreakable. The war was over, but the fear remained. And somewhere, far from the Tiber, a man named Hannibal still smiled. Years passed, and the world seemed to forget the man who once brought Rome to the brink of ruin. But Hannibal Barca did not disappear into the dust of defeat. After the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, where Scipio Africanus's legions crushed Carthage's final resistance, most believed Hannibal's story had ended. Yet, for Hannibal, survival itself became a new kind of warfare. He had lost an empire, but he refused to lose himself. The Romans celebrated their triumph, parading spoils through the streets, believing they had finally erased their greatest enemy. But somewhere along the coast of North Africa, the man who once shook the foundations of Rome began to plot again, not for conquest this time, but for vengeance, subtle and patient. In the aftermath of Carthage's surrender, Hannibal returned home to a city humiliated, disarmed, and chained by Roman demands. But Carthage still remembered who had once saved it from annihilation. When Hannibal entered the Senate, citizens cheered, veterans bowed their heads in respect. He was elected Suffete, the highest civil magistrate, and for a brief time, the man of war became a man of politics. He slashed corruption, reformed taxes, and rebuilt Carthage's economy with ruthless efficiency. Rome, however, watched from across the sea with growing suspicion. To them, Hannibal's intelligence was more dangerous than his army ever was. They feared not his swords, but his mind. Every Roman senator who had lived through the Punic Wars still saw his shadow in their dreams. Reports from spies whispered of a rejuvenated Carthage, of trade routes revived, of soldiers still loyal to the old general. The idea of Hannibal alive was itself an act of psychological warfare. Rome had crushed Carthage militarily but not spiritually. And Hannibal knew that his very existence, breathing, thinking, scheming, was enough to keep his enemies restless. When Roman envoys demanded his arrest under suspicion of plotting another war, Hannibal understood the message clearly: the Republic would never rest until he was dead. So he vanished. One night, under the cover of silence, Hannibal slipped out of Carthage and disappeared into the wider Mediterranean world. For Rome, it was both a relief and a nightmare. They no longer had to watch his every move, but they also no longer knew where he was. Somewhere out there, the ghost of Cannae walked again. Hannibal's exile turned into a legend of its own, a story of a hunted genius, drifting from kingdom to kingdom, forever one step ahead of the empire that feared him. His first refuge was in the court of King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, a ruler whose ambitions mirrored those of Hannibal's youth. The two men met as equals, warriors of vision and pride. Hannibal offered his services, not as a mercenary, but as a strategist who understood Rome's soul. He proposed a daring plan, an invasion of Italy, echoing his old triumphs. But Antiochus hesitated. Age had made Hannibal wiser, but it had also made his ideas too dangerous for cautious kings. His plan was dismissed, his genius once again mistrusted. And so the man who once commanded armies across 3 continents found himself reduced to an advisor, a mind sharper than ever, trapped within politics duller than any sword. When Antiochus finally went to war with Rome and lost, Hannibal fled once again, a relic of a bygone era now chased by assassins and treaties alike. Yet wherever he went, Rome followed in whispers and threats. Envoys carried demands to kings: surrender the Carthaginian. His presence was treated as a plague, a curse no ruler wished to shelter for long. But there was something poetic in his endless flight. Each new exile reminded Rome that it still feared him. The Senate's paranoia outlived the war itself. Eventually, Hannibal found refuge in Bithynia, under King Prusia's eye. It was a small, cautious kingdom on the edge of the Roman world, too weak to defy Rome, too proud to refuse Hannibal outright. There, the great general lived in a modest house near the sea, his hair graying, his eyes still sharp. He studied maps, corresponded with old allies, and occasionally trained local soldiers. To his neighbors, he was a strange, quiet man with the bearing of a legend. To himself, he was a warrior in waiting, a mind that refused to rust. Even as his body aged, his pride did not. He still read reports from Rome, still tracked their generals, still thought about the psychology of power. What he saw disturbed him, Rome was no longer the desperate republic he had once fought. It had become something far more dangerous, an empire that had learned from him. His tactics had been studied, copied, even perfected. The Romans now used the same deception and mobility that had once been his trademarks. Hannibal, unknowingly, had taught his enemy how to conquer the world. There was a tragic irony in it all. The man who had once fought to stop Roman expansion had, through his brilliance, ensured it. His defeats became their lessons, his genius their inheritance. And so Hannibal's war lived on, not in battles, but in the minds of the men who had once feared him most. The hunter had become the hunted, and yet, in a deeper sense, he still commanded the field. Rome's hatred for him bordered on obsession. Decades after Cannae, Roman senators still spoke his name as though it carried a curse. They sent envoys to Bithynia, demanding his surrender. They could not allow Hannibal to die quietly, they needed to kill him, to prove, finally, that the ghost of Cannae had been exorcised. But Hannibal was not done yet. He had one more game to play, one last trick to remind the world that even cornered, the mind of Hannibal Barca could not be subdued. His story was not over, not yet. The Roman agents were on their way, and the aging general waited in silence, already calculating how to turn death itself into victory. The empire that once trembled before him was about to learn a final lesson, that even the end of a man could be the beginning of a myth. The air in Bithynia grew thick with tension long before the Roman envoys arrived. Their demand was simple: surrender Hannibal Barca. But simplicity was never Rome's true language. Behind the courteous phrases of diplomacy lay vengeance sharpened by decades of humiliation. Rome no longer sought victory, it sought erasure. The Senate wanted not only Hannibal's capture but the death of his legend. For years they had hunted him through kingdoms and courts, across deserts and seas, driven by the same unhealed wound, the memory of Cannae. King Prusias of Bithynia felt the pressure immediately. His realm was small, his army insignificant, his loyalty to Hannibal nothing compared to the might of Rome. At first, he tried to balance both sides, promising the Romans nothing while assuring Hannibal that he was safe. But fear began to eat away at his resolve. Each messenger from Rome carried veiled threats, promises of destruction disguised as diplomacy. And Prusias, like so many before him, began to falter beneath the shadow of the Republic. Hannibal saw it all long before anyone dared to tell him. Betrayal had a scent, and he had smelled it many times before. In the camps of mutinous soldiers, in the courts of frightened kings, in the tone of men who suddenly avoided his gaze. He had always been a student of human fear. Now, old and exiled, he recognized it in his host. The king's courtiers spoke less when Hannibal entered the room. His letters began to go unanswered. Servants lingered outside at night, whispering about Roman guests. The great Carthaginian needed no confirmation. The trap was closing. One evening, as the sun set crimson over the sea, a loyal attendant slipped into Hannibal's chambers. His face was pale, his voice trembling. "Master," he whispered, "the Romans have come. They've demanded the king hand you over by morning." Hannibal simply nodded. There was no anger, only quiet satisfaction. "So Rome's patience has finally expired," he said. "They have chased my footsteps for 30 years. Perhaps it is time I lead them one last time." He rose and paced slowly through his modest villa, its walls covered in fading maps, relics of battles that had once shaken the world. His gaze lingered on the Alps sketched in charcoal, the line marking his impossible march into Italy. He smiled faintly. "They feared me then because I could not be predicted. Let that be true even now." That night, he refused food and wine. He sat beside a small oil lamp, writing by its flickering light. His letter to the Roman envoys was brief but cutting, part farewell, part taunt. "You have pursued me across the earth," he wrote, "and in doing so, you have confessed your fear. Rome's peace depends on the death of an old man. So be it. I will free you from your sleepless nights." He sealed it with his own ring, the same ring that held the secret of his escape. For inside that ring was the end of the chase. Beneath the carved insignia of House Barca lay a hidden chamber filled with poison. Hannibal had carried it for years, not as despair, but as strategy. He had vowed long ago that no Roman would ever touch him in chains. To die by his own hand was not surrender, it was command. As the night deepened, Hannibal spoke softly to his few remaining attendants. "They will come for me at dawn," he said. "Let them find me as I lived, free." When one servant began to weep, he silenced him with a gentle smile. "Do not mourn. This is not defeat. A lion does not fear the snare when he can choose when to roar." He looked out across the sea, where the dark waves mirrored the night sky. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Rome, still restless, still watching. "They think victory means possession," he whispered. "But the moment they need me dead to feel safe, they have already lost." The stars flickered above, cold and distant, as Hannibal prepared for his final act. He had no army, no banners, no allies, yet in that quiet room he still commanded the stage of history. For tomorrow, when the Romans came, they would not find a captive. They would find a message. The man who once shattered legions was about to shatter Rome's illusion of triumph. His last act would not be a battle, but a performance, his most calculated deception of all. Hannibal Barca, master of tactics and terror, was ready to turn death itself into his final victory. The soldiers surrounded Hannibal's villa at dawn. Their armor clinked softly as they prepared to seize the most feared enemy Rome had ever known. Inside, Hannibal sat calmly, the light of morning casting long shadows across maps of battles long past. He knew the end had come, and yet he smiled, for this, too, was a battlefield. When his servant warned that King Prusias had betrayed him, Hannibal only nodded. "Rome always wins her wars," he said, "but never her peace." From a small chest, he retrieved a ring, his final weapon. Inside it was poison, his assurance that Rome would never take him alive. Outside, the Romans waited for their triumph. They imagined dragging him through the streets, the Senate watching as their old nightmare finally bowed. Hannibal understood that to them, his humiliation was worth more than his death. But his mind, even in exile, refused to yield. He raised the ring, smiled faintly and whispered, "Let us now free the Romans from their long anxiety." The poison burned cold, quick, merciless. When the Romans entered moments later, they found him seated upright, serene, as if death itself had been tamed. On the table lay his message: "You have chased me across the world, and still I command your peace." Rome's agents looked upon him not as a prisoner, but as a reminder that even victory can feel like defeat. Hannibal had chosen his ending, not as a fugitive, but as a commander. In that quiet act of defiance, he won his final war, the battle for how history would remember him. Rome received the news of Hannibal's death without cheers. The Senate gathered, but no one rejoiced. They had pursued him for decades, and now that he was gone, victory felt strangely hollow. The man who had haunted their dreams had denied them spectacle. No chains, no parade, no conquest. Only silence. They called it justice, yet it felt like loss. Older senators who had lived through Cannae remembered the horror of his genius, how he broke their armies and, worse, their confidence. Even Livy would later write that Hannibal was a man whom Rome feared even in his absence. His death did not cleanse their shame, it deepened it. Rome's armies grew bolder, its empire wider, but every new campaign bore traces of his influence. Generals studied his ambushes and formations. His tactics became doctrine. In their obsession to destroy him, Rome had learned from him, and in learning, became him. Yet emotionally, the Republic could never let go. For centuries, Roman mothers warned their children, "Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates." His name became more than a memory, it became a superstition. The empire that had conquered the world still trembled at a ghost. Even philosophers found meaning in his death. Some claimed Hannibal's suicide was the final proof that freedom outlives empire, that he had chosen to die unbroken, and in doing so, had won. Rome could dominate the earth, but not his will. Hannibal had become what Rome could never destroy, a reflection of its own limits. The Republic survived him, but never escaped him. Time buried empires, but not Hannibal's legend. To conquerors and rebels alike, his name became a symbol of unyielding defiance, a man who waged war not only with armies, but with intellect. Even in defeat, he remained undefeated in spirit. His life was a study in endurance. From the frozen Alps to the sands of Africa, he defied the laws of possibility. Every triumph and every loss taught the world that true strength lies not in numbers, but in the courage to think differently. Centuries later, generals like Napoleon, Frederick, and Patton still studied his battles as sacred texts. But beyond strategy, Hannibal's legacy was philosophical. His final act, the choice of death over capture, became his masterpiece. In that moment, he transformed from a mortal enemy into an eternal symbol. Rome could conquer nations, but not the will of a man who refused submission. Hannibal taught the world that power is temporary, but defiance can be immortal. His victories inspired fear, his death inspired respect. Every empire since Rome has looked upon his story as both warning and wonder, proof that the human mind, when disciplined by purpose, is stronger than any army. Even now, historians call him the greatest tactician who ever lived. But his true genius was not in destroying Rome. It was in haunting it forever. His shadow stretched across time, reminding all who seek dominance that brilliance and rebellion often walk hand in hand. Hannibal Barca died without empire or crown, yet his name endures where empires fade. His story is the anthem of the unconquered mind, and through it he achieved the one victory Rome could never claim: immortality.